The third position on world affirming. God expects us to get along in life as Christians, not to stand out like an ugly wart. The earlier two views were this. First of all, antinomianism, that there is no such thing as wrong or evil or sin. And secondly, that it's okay to be worldly or to use worldly ideas and hold to worldly values as long as we are attempting to reach others. And you remember my argument there was, well, if you're holding worldly values, then what are you trying to reach others with then? You certainly couldn't be trying to reach them with the Christian message. Now here's a third group of people and a third world-affirming argument that is even more important than some of the earlier ones we've looked at. And I just hope that in all of the things I've had to say thus far, you're still following along, understanding why did we even look so much, and we'll continue to look at fundamentalism and neo-evangelicalism. That wasn't a side issue in church history or theology. That very, very much has to do with precisely what we're discussing now. The church is hardly even, as I'll read a quote here in a moment, distinguishable from the world anymore. Why is it? Well, Christians today have come across this brilliant notion, they've wised up on the fundamentalists. They were wrong earlier. And we need to forsake the tenets of fundamentalism, particularly the one of their separatist ideas, that they should separate from those that don't hold to similar beliefs and opinions. And so what's happening? We've got a church today which finds itself increasingly unable to address the moral and doctrinal problems in the church and in the world today. That says to me a lot about who's right with neo-evangelicals and fundamentalists. So this argument says that God expects us to get along in life. And He doesn't expect us to have all of the social outcast problems that people such as the fundamentalists had. And whenever you stand out with funny doctrines and weird dress and strange moral behavior like an ugly wart, you can't get along with the world. This also has its overtones of witnessing and evangelism in it, as number 2 specifically did. Because how can you reach someone when they see you as a person from outer space? You've got such strange convictions and such strange moral life and behavior. They tell us that the world has laughed at the church's ignorance and its backward ways long enough. We need to meet the world on its own terms, on its own ground, if we're ever going to convincingly say anything about the gospel to them. Now, are you hearing what I'm saying? We've got to meet them on their own ground. We've got to play their game if we're ever going to reach them. But my critique of this would be similar to number 2. If you're playing their game, what do you have to reach them with then? You become indistinguishable from them. There has to be a standing out, a social outcast experience. They call it, we look like an ugly wart to others. There has to be that if there are going to be two groups of people, one with what is true and one with what is not. Their argument is we should not be so naive about the world and so naive about sin as just to ascribe everything to this business of Adam and original sin. I mean, how you're brought up affects the way you live, and they go into all these explanations. They say we shouldn't be so naive. Our naivete is offensive to the world. And again, the byproduct argument would be if we're offensive, how can we ever reach someone? But then if we follow their argument, mine would be, if you're not offensive, what are you going to reach them with? You're just like them. You don't have anything different from them to give to them. And they produce, at this juncture, the typical examples from history of the church and its ignorance and how it was stupid and it was backward, it was pre-scientific, and it was the worse for it. For instance, they tell us, well, now in Galileo's trial, did not the church maintain flat earth and earth-centered universe theories? The church was behind the times, in other words. That's what Galileo was tried for. He was pronounced by the Roman Catholic Church a heretic. And he had to recant, which Galileo did. Privately, he held his convictions. But to stay in faith with the Roman Catholic Church, he had to recant his views that the earth was not flat, and that the earth was not the center of the universe. Rather, the sun was. The sun didn't revolve around the earth, but rather the earth revolved around the sun. And they love to bring those examples, in other words, showing us that you've been wrong in the past. The church has been pre-scientific and ignorant and naive and offensive and stupid in the past. Are you not the same way right now with your business of you don't let your children date, you don't let your children because the mothers don't wear pants, all of these funny notions and views that you people have? Will that not in the future be proven to be false just like this was false? Or another typical example that they love to use is the creation in 4004 BC of the earth, Archbishop James Ussher, the Irish Archbishop. Well, we recognize that the church has been and can be wrong about things. Here are some examples. But just because we've been wrong doesn't mean we need to give up everything that we're doing just in case it might be wrong. Rather, address each one of the issues and find out whether or not you're wrong. The church was so medieval and so pre-scientific, so traditionally based. You see, that's their whole argument. That's the thought here. So traditionally based in the Middle Ages and the time of Galileo that it refused to change anything. It refused to even revise its views on the solar system. And you've got some neo-evangelicals telling us the same thing about creation and evolution today. Professor Young's son, another Dr. Davis, but now a Dr. Davis in geology, is one of these who believes in these fanciful views of theistic evolution. They're telling us now, you see, the Scopes trial and the media made a mockery of William Jennings Bryan and the whole hillbilly, southern, offensive, ignorant, fundamentalist mentality. They made a mockery of that. And so we should give that up. After all, geologists have proven that the earth is so many billion years old. No, they haven't proven a thing. A person's a fool to follow that. We've shown you before in the creation studies, they invent the method by which they date and then apply their own method to dating, but their method has never been proven to be right or wrong. I mean, they have never proven it to anyone's satisfaction that this is the way that you date. They came up with a theory, such and such strata means it's so many years old. And as I've told you before, the stories have been many and they've been ludicrous when they find Volkswagens or Coke bottles down there in that 2 trillion-year-old strata. Somehow that never makes it into a scientific journal. And yet that has happened. That strata was supposed to be laid so many millions of years ago. But you find a big pin down there, though. And what do you say about that? Well, it's some type of fluke, and they come up with these underground rivers, and it was a river above ground, and caught the pin and took it down into the deep strata. And you can tell when someone's hedging on you. Why not just give up your theory? Why have to hedge all the day long whenever you find something like that? Why not just give up the theory? But they won't. It's part of the demonic, secular mentality of today to rule God out of everything possible. Rule him out of the school, out of home, out of church, out of government. Get him out of everything. And say, well, we're basing this all on First Amendment, free speech. We're basing this on the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson's so-called separation clause, which is not constitutional. It's just Thomas Jefferson's idea that the church should be separate from the state. And it depends on how one interprets that anyway. Founding Fathers never meant what the American Civil Liberties Union today thinks that they meant by that. American Civil Liberties Union, I better not even get off on that. I mean, I was reading something the other day, they're in favor of pornography. I mean, they're in favor of free speech, free actions. They're in favor of freedom because they think if you ever restrict one freedom, they say, I'll tell you what's going to happen. We're going to go back, we'll revert back to medieval Roman Catholicism where the church dominates the state. That's what they're afraid of. The church, today it wouldn't be Catholicism, it'd be Lynchburg, Virginia, will dominate the state. They will elect politicians and fire politicians. They will be the politicians. And they don't ever want that to happen. So it's free speech, free everything. It's freedom, personal freedom for everything. And I was reading an article where, in this case of pornography, a violent pornography where it involved murder, not only child abuse, but the decapitation of children and so forth, that the American Civil Liberties Union said we're not going to fight it. We're still in favor of it. I mean, it's producing death and horror stories in people. Prostitution and pornography, it's so demeaning to women. If nothing else, it's so demeaning to them. And American Civil Liberties Union said, no, we can't restrict that. If you restrict that, that's the first step in going back to medieval Roman Catholicism. And so the ignorant church of today is almost saying the same thing, that we got to come out of our backward pre-scientific ways and mingle with the world and mix with the world. Maybe not tackle them, but at least mingle and mix with them. And not reproduce in our day and age the problems of Galileo and Archbishop Usher's date and so forth. So one fellow had to say this, in regard to acquiring and using material wealth, in regard to sexuality and family life, fornication, divorce, abortion, and the rest, and in many other ways, Christians are increasingly indistinguishable in the secular culture they live in. Less and less are they living that way of life which is integral to what they are as Christians. If this is true, and it's certainly true, that Christians are becoming less and less able to live the Christian life today. They are becoming less and less faithful to what they say their Christian convictions are. If this is true, then I think that the whole neo-evangelical argument of rejection of fundamentalist separatism is based on a fallacy then. The church, in other words, is not getting better. She rejected fundamentalism, said we don't want to hold all these narrow social taboos up here. We want, because those aren't scriptural, and we can't reach the world that way. We're offensive to the world that way. All right, if your argument, if it's scriptural, it should work then. The church should be getting better and better in the world. Now, we may have an increase in statistics from Mr. George Gallup of how many people say they're born again in this country. But as we'll see later in this study in Christian ethics, people are saying that they're born again just because they, did anything from got a new job to graduated from college. Born again just means you enter a new phase of your life. It doesn't necessarily have a religious connotation to it. You have millions of people who claim to be born again. And you have millions who claim in the religious sense to be born again. But that doesn't mean that they meet the scriptural requirements or they produce the biblical fruit that informs us, in fact, they are truly born again. That they are born again, their lives have changed. Their lives have not changed. And they are arguing that we should stay pretty much the same as we are, living in the world and living of the world, lest we stand out like an ugly wart and not have any effect upon the world. They say that we should be acceptable to the world. But being acceptable to the world is just what the Bible speaks against. Israel was not acceptable to the pagan nations. The prophets were not acceptable to Israel. Jesus was not acceptable to the religious leaders. And the early church was not acceptable to the world in which they lived. I think this is where the world has so greatly influenced the church and the church's argument. You'll look over in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7 for just a quick moment. This verse is often brought up. 1 Timothy 3:7. I mean, if you had a pastor who was like Ezekiel and did some of the things Ezekiel did, then their argument is, how could this verse ever be fulfilled, and how could you ever reach anyone? Moreover, he, and it's really true of the whole church, every person in the church must have a good report of them which are without. A good report of them which are without. 1 Timothy 3:7. But you see, it is a matter of interpretation, and this verse has to be interpreted in light of how the early church and its leaders lived in the first century. Do we call being thrown into jail and killed with the sword and locked in prison having a good report with others? I mean, if we don't, that is what happened to the early apostles when they violated 1 Timothy 3:7. What he means is you can't have obvious moral flaws in your life and profess to be a leader of the church. That is offensive to the world out there. You can't have obvious moral flaws. Most of the qualifications for a leader here are in the personal, spiritual, moral area in sense. And I'm saying what is true of them has to be true of every Christian. Which, in other words, of these requirements of the pastor could you break and still call yourself a Christian? I mean, they're true for all of us here. That you must be, well, look, verse 3, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, gentle, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house. Don't you have to do all those things too? Well, surely we all have to. Verse 7, he must have a good report of them that are without. They know that you're not a drinker, you pay your bills on time, you have a good moral report in their eyes. They may hate, and they should. If they have any sense and you're living anything, your Christianity, your biblical convictions, they might even hate the moral life that you live. But you have a good report in the sense that they know you're not a wife beater, you're not a drinker, you're not a child abuser, and we can even lessen it, get on some lower levels. I mean, you pay your bills on time. That is what Paul means when he says we're to have a good report. He doesn't mean that everyone in the world is to buddy up to you and just see you as no different than the neighbor who's lost on the other side of them. That's not what Paul is saying. Have a good report so that the world loves you as it loves its own. Jesus said, the world will not love you because you do not belong to the world. John 15 and John 17. He said, if the world hates you, right? If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. What are we going to do with verses like that? They seem to forget. It's very convenient forgetfulness on their part, I would say. They seem to forget verses like that. The neo-evangelicals who are doing all of the arguing. Those verses square with the verse we're looking at here. There is a sense in which we can have a good report. I hope that I have a good report. I know that the people I've come into contact with, I've had a good report with them. I was in bed last night as I was trying to go to sleep, thinking about all of my high school and college days and the roommates that I had and the people that I knew, and I had a good report with all of those people. And yet I was hated and mocked at the same time. You could have that. They knew that I was weird, but then there was a sense in which I wasn't weird. That I didn't just, float around above treetops or something to prove my Christianity. There was something that was regular and daily about me, but there was something that wasn't. And we have to be able to live that type of life. We don't want to compromise our convictions. We don't want to see if we can make people hate us more than they're already hating us by doing something off the wall, in other words. You're asking for trouble, and that's not scriptural. If you're living the normal Christian life where you believe in biblical truth and biblical morals, in a world like ours, you will be hated for it. If you're not hated, you're doing something wrong. That's the proof of the pudding right there. If you're not being hated, if people aren't talking about you, if you are everyone's friend, you're doing something wrong. Turn over with me, secondly, to Luke chapter 6, and I'll show you where Jesus also said this in the Sermon on the Plain, as Luke gives it to us. Luke 6 and verse 26. Listen to this. Woe unto you when all men speak well of you. That's a woe in the eyes of Jesus. The church would say, praise God when all men speak well of you. Then you can witness to them. What perverted logic. As I've said before, if all men speak well of you, what do you have to tell them that they want to know that they don't already have? Of all things, surprise of surprises, it's a woe in God's catalog when all men speak well of us. It's a woe when we don't stand out like an ugly wart. Woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you. Why? For so did their fathers to the false prophets. In other words, so did their fathers to those that were just like themselves. What the false prophets come along saying? But what the people wanted to hear, right? They prophesied what they wanted to hear. And so they spoke well of them. You come along living or speaking like people don't want you to, then they will not speak well of you. So let's understand how such ideas relate as Luke 6 and 1 Timothy 3. You should have a good report. I mean, you have to be above reproach in the discipline of your children, the regulation of your home life, your work habits. You have to be above reproach in those areas. But we can't use that as kind of a lever of compromise so that we just kind of blend in with the world and there's not anything distinctive about us. And it's not that you have to try. I don't have to try. If you've got biblical views about things, that is what makes you distinctive, and that is your distinctive. You've got biblical views of morals. You've got biblical views of doctrine. You've got biblical views of this business of personal freedom. You've got biblical views of this business of, well, every man is entitled to his own opinion. No, he's not. Every man's entitled only to God's view of things, the way things really are. And if he chooses something else, he'll answer to his Maker for that. God has said, here's the truth. You believe it, and if you choose otherwise, you're disobedient, you'll be punished for that. And they like us to state our belief, then they state theirs, and they say, kind of pat us on the back, and we're supposed to grin, well, to each his own, right? And then you say to them, no, wrong. No, it's wrong. Not to each his own. If you have a wrong belief, you are wrong. You're not entitled to that wrong belief that you have. They'll crawl the wall to hear that. But that's what you have to tell them. You can do it in a nice, polite way. Generally, thankfully, we don't have to walk around naked for 3 years as Isaiah did to prove our message. Isaiah chapter 20. Naked and barefoot he ran around. Think of that. I mean, think of what the neo-evangelicals would say about that if they were living in the Old Testament period. Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel of all people, you weird soul. This is a psycho here in Ezekiel's case, building these little castles and cities and fighting and all this. It's a psycho number one here with prophet Ezekiel. I mean, he didn't mix very well with people, and he almost did things, it looks like, to antagonize people. We don't have quite that emphasis in the New Testament. If we did, we'd live it. We'd build castles out on Main Street and fight against it and say, thus saith the Lord, Pulteney shall fall in 40 days if it doesn't repent. Generally, that's not found in the New Testament. That's not the emphasis that you find in the Old. But we're still to allow our moral lives and our doctrines to speak very loudly. And Christian politeness doesn't mean that you always have to wait before you're asked. What if the apostles sat around at the gate beautiful, just waiting until someone asked them to preach about Jesus? They preached whether they were asked or not. They preached whenever people told them not to preach. Again, be led of the Spirit. But people, they try to throw in our face what they would think would be our Christian convictions, like politeness. Well, I never even asked you about that. Wouldn't you be polite enough to give me my privacy here? You say, it's not a business of politeness here. It's a matter of God has given me a word to a dying generation. He's put me as a watchman upon the wall, and I'm supposed to talk. I'm supposed to say something. It's not a question of Christian politeness here. You see what I'm saying? It's interesting how they turn on us what they think are Christian virtues and say, well, you aren't even practicing your own virtues. You're supposed to be quiet and polite and reserved and all of this, and here you are blaring the gospel away to me. Well, that's just oftentimes the way that it has to be. Now, in Ezekiel, a couple of passages in Ezekiel, I don't think Ezekiel was a psycho. I just think he was weird. No, not really. He had a message, and he had a way in which God gave it to him to get across to the people. And we find some of that in the New Testament. Agabus, remember, acted out one of his prophecies over in, that must be Acts 22 or so. Acts 22, I believe. Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel 16. Now, I'm not going to read this because look how long it is. But I am going to ask that you would read it during the next week. Ezekiel 16. It's a whole history of God's dealing with Israel. That he saved her when she was the least and the worst of peoples to be saved, and made her beautiful and gave her everything. And then what did she do? She went out and prostituted the good things God had given her. She went out and blasphemed the Lord. She compromised all her beliefs. And it's like she was begging to be deceived and begging to apostatize from the faith. Went out having relations with all of the other nations. I don't know if you're familiar with the chapter, but take a day this week to read that chapter and think about it in light of Christian history and the Christian church. And I think the message will be clear enough to you. And then in chapter 23, I believe, of Ezekiel's prophecy, I'll read just a little of this. Chapter 23, beginning with verse 11. And when her sister, Aholibah, saw this, she was more corrupt in her inordinate love than she. It's a contrast between the north and the south, the falling of Samaria and the falling of Jerusalem. And in her whoredoms, more than her sister in her whoredoms, she doted upon the Assyrians, her neighbors, captains and rulers, clothed most gorgeously, horsemen riding upon horses, all of them desirable young men. Then I saw that she was defiled, that they took both one way, and that she increased her whoredoms. For when she saw men portrayed upon the wall, the image of the Chaldeans portrayed in vermilion, girded with girdles upon their loins, exceeding and dyed attire upon their heads. Transfer it to the church, how she's attracted to the fashions of the world and to the ways of the world, exactly like Israel was. And it spelled her doom. How does the church think she's going to escape? All she does almost is read the New Testament and look for promises of God's love. And the church is a group of people, God's people today, just like Israel was at one time. And what did God say? Israel, when you go into the land, I want you to be narrow. Throw out all the pagans. Destroy their altars. Burn down everything that they've done. I don't even want you to desire the gold. You can't even baptize or sanctify the gold in some of their heathen idols. Burn it all and get rid of it. Because he said, if you don't, it'll be a snare to you in your life. And it was. And so we're being told that the church should find what is salvageable in the world and try to bring it into, like rock and roll music we talked about last time, bring it into the church, baptize it, christen it, give it a new name, and now use it for the glory of God. You can't. You can't use the devil's ways and his mentality and his philosophy and his value system for the glory of God. It can't be done. There's light and there's darkness. There's God. You either serve God or you serve another master. As soon as she saw them with her eyes, she doted upon them and sent messengers unto them into Chaldea. And the Babylonians came to her into the bed of love, and they defiled her with their whoredom, and she was polluted with them, and her mind was alienated from them. And she discovered her whoredoms and discovered her nakedness. Then my mind was alienated from her, like as my mind was alienated from her sister. Yet she multiplied her whoredoms, in calling to remembrance the days of her youth, wherein she had played the harlot in the land of Egypt. For she doted upon their paramours, whose flesh is as the flesh of asses, and whose issue is like the issue of horses. Thus thou callest to remembrance the lewdness of thy youth, and bruising thy tits by the Egyptians for the paps of thy youth. A good picture of what we're finding take place in the world. Listen to what another writer has to say. He said, evangelicals, he really means fundamentalists, but he won't admit it here, once said to the world, what we say is true because the world despises us and disdains our message and membership. That used to be proof of the fact you were in good relation to God, as everyone thought evil of you. He said that's what evangelicals once said. In the late 20th century, however, one consistently hears the opposite. The church says, look at us. You can tell that what we say is true because so many people are signing up or applauding us, and we are finding more favor in the national arena. The whole mentality has been reversed today. At one time, we said that we're right because everyone hates us. We kind of had a persecution complex in the church, which is kind of healthy to have. We know we're right because everyone hates us. Now, what are we saying? We know we're right because we've got the biggest churches, the best speakers, the most educated leaders. And we even have one running for the highest office of the greatest country in the world today. From what I understand, the auditorium, the largest church auditorium in the United States, is in Rockwell, Texas. And of course, it's Church on the Rock, Larry Lee's church, charismatic, word of faith, health and wealth, prosperity cult church. And what they say is, look, it must be the right message. It must be the right. We've got the largest church. It seats 6,000 people, which says a lot about those churches that claim 20,000 membership. From what I know, the largest church auditorium, a regular church building, seats 6,000. It's charismatic. And I think 7 or 8 out of the largest 10 in North America are charismatic. And the charismatics just use that, and this is health and wealth. I mean, hyper health and wealth. I mean, like Bob Tilton is down there in that area. Bob Tilton is probably the worst charismatic teacher who's ever been invented. He's that bad. And they're saying because the church applauds us, they're signing up, because look at the numbers that we have. It proves that we're right. At one time you said just the opposite. You said, look, we only have 12. That proves we were like Jesus because he only had 12. Now if you've got 12, both you and the head of the deacons as well as your pastor friends are berating you over that. 12, you've got to do something. Grow, grow, grow. The church did say, what we say is true because the world despises us. Now the church says, look at us. You can tell that what we say is true because so many people are signing up or applauding us. We're finding more favor in the national arena. And listen to what that liberal church historian at the University of Chicago, a Lutheran church historian, Martin Marty, has to say. Marty, who writes the column in the Christian Century, the liberal counterpart to the conservative CT, Christianity Today, writes, and he's not even saved as far as I'm concerned. I mean, that's how liberal church leader in the United States of America. I'm sure you've heard of Martin Marty. Anytime or anyone wants to get a quote from someone about, even about Tammy and Jim, they'll go to Martin Marty because he's the best known figure. I would applaud, Marty says, the many ways in which the old crabbiness, he means fundamentalism, has gone. But I would have to scratch my head to see what happened to the theology that says, love not the world. Said, I would applaud the way in which the old crabbiness has gone, but I would have to scratch my head to see what, he's bald, by the way, to see what would happen, mostly bald, what would happen to the theology that also says, love not the world. As such, Protestantism has moved into the grab and get culture of beautiful people, sports stars, and financial successes. He's exactly right. A liberal. He's exactly right. Why does he have something to criticize? Why did we even give him something? Evangelical church gives it, and they don't think it's anything wrong. They think we should be like the world. We don't want to stand out like an ugly wart. He said, what has happened to the love not the world theology? That still is in John. Regardless of what the fundamentalists have to say or the neo-evangelicals, that still is in the Bible. Love not the world. Neither the things in it. If you love the world, you don't love God. That's John's argument. 1 John 2, verses 15, 16, and 17. See, they conveniently enough forget about all of those texts. All they can think about is, well, Jesus, Matthew's party church, he went to a sinners group in Matthew 9. That's the only ones they can think about. They don't know how to explain anything. It's just they're grabbing for proof tags to justify their moral compromise. They're going to do it anyway, you see. But they want their conscience to be okay. They don't want their conscience screaming at them all night long. And so they conveniently enough forget about those scriptures that say don't love the world. And they forget about Israel's history. Her history is one of disobedience to God, manifested in the fact that she aligned herself with the world, other nations, and God sent her into captivity as a result. And finally rejected her temporarily, but for over 2,000 years now, just totally rejected her. And the church has been put in her place. And remember what Paul argues? He said, church, don't you be so haughty. God can reject you, just like he rejected Israel. Romans 9, 10, and 11. He can reject you and start up a new thing. He can reject you and return to Israel. And he's going to one day. Hey, see, that's the good news for us, the bad news for them. Because what did Paul say in 1 Timothy 4? This, the Spirit says expressly, that in the latter times some will depart from the faith. And he says there's going to come a great falling away before the end times come. That's 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. God is going to reject the church. He's going to go back to Israel and restore Israel. He's in the process politically of doing it now, but she's restored in unbelief, though. Those Jews think they're over there with their land in 1948 and their city in 1967 by their own power, by their own progress. They're not. God has done it for them. They're restored in unbelief, but they will believe. Romans 11:26, and so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, a deliverer shall come forth out of Jacob and shall turn away their ungodliness. He's going to reject this old, unbelieving, apostate, worldly, carnal, neo-evangelical church of our day that's saying we got to be like the world to attract the world. We got to be like the world because we enjoy the world. We don't want to be narrow in our thoughts and beliefs, they say. It'll be just like Galileo or Archbishop Usher. You can be narrow in your beliefs, listen to me, friends, without being wrong. No one says let's be as wrong as possible because that'll make us narrow. You'll be narrow, all right. But you don't get any rewards in heaven for believing in a flat earth theory just because the rest of the world knows that it's round. In other words, what are facts are facts. The church should be able to recognize those. If geology gave us the facts, we would recognize them and be willing to admit them, but they lie to us, though. If the secular media told us the truth that the values of humanism and secularism were the right way, well, we would be responsible, because we're truth-seeking people, to believe what it says. Fact is, it doesn't tell us the truth. As that last century British Roman Catholic writer, he's Roman Catholic, but I quote from him a lot because he's a good writer, G.K. Chesterton had to say, you know what Christianity is? He says, I'll tell you, Christianity is a truth-telling thing. It's a truth-telling thing. G.K. Chesterton was right. Catholic or non-Catholic, he converted to Catholicism. C.S. Lewis bases a lot of his thoughts and his apologetics on G.K. Chesterton, famous British Roman Catholic writer. Christianity is a truth-telling thing. It tells us the truth, and that's why we're responsible to believe it. I'm willing to believe whatever the nuclear physicists or whatever want to tell us about the universe. If they can give me more understanding about the universe that can help me glorify God more, that's fine. But a lot of what they're involved in, a lot of what they have to say, is not right, it's wrong. I mean, we spent a whole decade, Kennedy said we'll do it before the turn of the decade, and we did, 1969, to put a man on the moon to do what? Bring back a bag of rocks. Come on, I got those in my driveway. Maybe that's somewhat of a little unfair caricature, but that's the way I say it. You went to the moon to bring back a bag of rocks. We got tons of piles of rocks around here. Shipped them all over the country to pet moon rocks. That costs us millions and millions of dollars and men's lives to do that. And then you're crying the whole time that we don't have enough money to do this or do that, or at least pay a trillionth of the interest on our national debt. Well, there went a good bit of it out the window or into outer space, literally right then. Went to the moon to bring back a bag of rocks. What rockheads? That's why I don't want to believe what a lot of the so-called experts tell us. Even if what they have discovered about the universe is right, why are you wasting your time? That's not going to affect your eternal destiny, whether you get a certain spaceship to go however many billions of miles in the universe. That's not practical. Back to what we were talking about last time. How does that affect in biblical lit? Comparing translations, Phil's notebooks, it doesn't change your life. How does that affect your life for the good? Why don't you join the Peace Corps or something? You can at least do something for someone then. But instead, they stay locked away in some physicist lab or astronomer's lab on Mount Palomar in California or whatever. Just doing what? Just looking, hoping that I'll be the next one to discover the newest planet or exploding star, supernova, or black hole. That doesn't do anything for us, though. We human beings, we're not concerned about outer space. So we ought to be concerned about things that concern us, and that is truth. And the world isn't, and the church is trying to run us off as well. I'm going to use, just for a few moments here, another writer's thoughts in giving you what he calls 3 underlying dynamics of Christian living. And this is on the subject of worldliness. Now, just because it's another writer, don't think that it's bad. Some of you, whenever I stop talking, you stop writing. Oh, that's somebody he's quoting. Well, I generally preface it with a statement of whether it's worth writing or not. I mean, I agree with what he has to say. 3 dynamics of Christian living. The first dynamic is the influence of social environments. The influence of social environments. An environment is simply a group of people who come together in some way. To use a sociological term, an environment is a stable social situation. In the Acts of the Apostles, we are told of the Church of Jerusalem that, quote, all who believed were together. Chapter 2, and it's repeated in chapter 4. Now, this writer has the following to say. One of the reasons the early Christians stayed alive as Christians, we know this from experience in this church, was that they were together. They were together on numerous occasions for the spiritual well-being and edification of one another. Now you contrast that, this man happens to be, well, I won't even say that because then you'll probably stop writing the rest of what he has to say. I won't tell you what his faults are. But you contrast that with the rest of the church and the world out there. They're together, they think they're doing God a service. It's a privilege to God to have them in his house for an hour or two a week. And they think that they've done meritorious work to be there an hour or two a week. And the rest of their life is devoted to their career, business, family, home, their pursuits, higher education, whatever. And we believe in more of a spirit of togetherness because it's what the Scriptures teach. They were together. So there is one dynamic for Christian living. It's the type of social environment in which you find yourself. Secondly, he said the second underlying dynamic has to do with the effect of patterns of social behavior on basic morality. This is very good. The effect that patterns of social behavior have on basic morality. You see, the secular media tries its best to encourage us that things are valueless. You hear a lot about so-called values-free education. You hear a lot about that, and I was trained in education, so I'm familiar with that. Values-free education or value-less education. There is no such animal. You're either being taught the values of God or the values of Satan, one or the other. There's no such thing as value-less education. And so what he's saying here is that certain patterns of social behavior do affect morality. There's no such thing as just being in a vacuum or being neutral. The way you live your social life, he'll explain here in a few moments. I will from him. The way you live your social life has a profound effect on your moral beliefs. In other words, you can't have moral beliefs and then live close to, in agreement with, a world that contradicts those moral beliefs and expect for them to be maintained and upheld. They will not. They will erode. Suddenly, unconsciously, over a long period of time, whatever the case might be, they will erode. So you can say, I believe in monogamous marriage. You spend a lot of time, biblical marriage, you spend a lot of time watching television which just encourages just the opposite. I mean, that's just old-fashioned. That's boring. I mean, you couldn't even make a show anymore to have someone who believes in monogamous marriage. If you spend a lot of time watching that, that will affect your marriage. I know what people say, no, it won't affect me at all. They're ignoramuses. They're not even cognizant of scientific studies which have been done, let alone the Word of God, that said that you'll either be conformed to the world by the world, or you'll be transformed by the renewing of your mind by the Word of God to get away from the world. Either the Word will conform you to itself, or the world will conform you to itself. Neutrality is a myth when it comes to morality and social behavior. It is the myth of neutrality. Well, he explains it more simply for us. He says this: certain ways of doing things help us to be moral. I mean, this is written on a very, very low elementary level. Certain ways of doing things help us to be moral, while other ways of doing things make it difficult to be moral. Christians generally see the importance of keeping the Ten Commandments. They know that there are things that they absolutely cannot do: murder, commit adultery, and steal. But they do not see the connection between social customs and keeping the commandments. By the way, the fellow I am quoting from is a scholar. He has a doctor's degree, and it may be in sociology. He's very familiar with this, even from a worldly point of view. But he is a charismatic Christian. They do not see the connection between social customs and keeping the commandments. As a result, they adopt social customs or patterns that are not conducive to being moral. They do not realize that there needs to be a consistency between their fundamental moral principles and the way they live. Because they are not concerned to be consistent, they get to a point where it becomes virtually impossible for them to remain faithful to basic moral precepts. They do not know where to draw the line, and so they often get themselves into hot water. Let us take the example of the sexual revolution. See, I'm not the only one who's always talking about sex, am I? We discussed this several months ago whenever we started in this business of worldliness. That is one of the explosive problems in the world today. And I said either I can be talking about sex all the time because I'm interested in it, or I can be talking about it all the time because it is a subject that needs to be addressed. In the post-1960 phase, Americans' sexual attitudes and behavior have changed drastically. The studies indicate that sexual morality has been eroding for everybody. Well, any fool knows that's true. Christians included. Any fool knows that's true also. Research shows that young Christians, even junior high children from intact church-going families, are joining the sexual revolution. See, their parents are doing something wrong in the raising of them. Their parents have been affected by this new morality, this post-revolution age in which we live, sexual revolution of the 1960s. 1920s, the flapper age, it was just minor compared to what happened in the 1960s. And time, several decades after both of those, have proven that statement to be true. They're doing something wrong that's affecting their children. What if you, for instance, what if you allow them to date and to do all the things that the typical parent not only allows but almost encourages? They think their child is weird if he's 13 and never kissed a girl or held her hand or something. What's wrong, Johnny boy? You gay or something? You got to go out there and get you a girlfriend. Encouraging it at young ages. One reason for widespread sexual immorality among Christians is that parents accept social patterns that are inconsistent with Christian morality. You can't send a young couple to the movie to watch just about anything together and sit back there holding hands in the darkened movie theater. You can't encourage behavior. You have to discourage. You have to forbid behavior. You have to discipline for behavior like that. You encourage them. You encourage them to listen to certain types of music, or if you don't encourage, you allow them to. And I'm not suggesting that anyone in this church does, but let's make sure that it's not true in this church. We know it is outside of this church. Then you're asking for problems. They do not start the battle for sexual morality soon enough. By the time they get to the place where they make a stand for basic morality, they have already conceded so much ground that it's too late to reverse the trend. And it is. Once a child, and not just this area, any area, and it's true for adults in any area, once you've had the forbidden fruit of Eden, it's hard to go back. The same point applies to every area of morality. For example, we recognize spouses' permanent moral responsibility for one another and parents' moral responsibility to raise their children in the Christian life. Remember, he's talking about the fact there's a connection between moral beliefs and the way you live your social life. But if we also accept the self-seeking patterns of life that go along with materialistic acquisition in our increasingly secular society, then we will find that marriages disintegrate and children are not given adequate discipline and care. In other words, he's saying that you're not going to just have problems in your marriage if you start being influenced by wrong marital practice, such as wife swapping or whatever. But if you're affected in another area, such as material acquisition, then the greed and it speaks of the self-life and selfishness. Then the greed that leads to that will lead to selfishness in your marriage, which will produce breakdowns, maritally speaking, right there. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one relation or connection. If you start missing it in morals in some other area, he's saying it's going to affect everything in your life. The way you live your whole social life affects your whole moral life, is what he's saying. We will also find that Christians are having a difficult time keeping the commandments against lying and stealing because of rampant, or as Dr. Freeman always used to say, rampant. I don't know why he said it that way. It's not dictionary pronunciation. He's not from the South either, but rampant materialistic acquisition in our increasingly secular society. And then here's the third dynamic. I thought this was good enough to give you. The third dynamic underlying good basic Christian living, he said, it concerns what I call carriers of anti-Christian values and attitudes. You know how there's some diseases that are contagious. People are carriers of them. You can maybe even touch a doorknob and pick up germs and get a certain ailment or whatever. So that's what he means by carriers of anti-Christian values and attitudes. Again, reading from him, I suggest the following list of the most important carriers of anti-Christian values and attitudes in American social life today. Here's his list. And I think it's very good. And you could probably make one that'd read very similar. Most important carriers of anti-Christian attitudes and values. Number one, friends and acquaintances. I mean, I just thought that, for the life of me, came with Christianity. That when you got saved, you lost all of your lost friends. You either saved them or lost them, one or the other. That was never true with anyone that I knew whenever I first got saved. They kept the same lost friends. They were no different. The friends weren't, and evidently neither were they. I couldn't convince some of my relatives. They had the same lost friends, the same lost... Whenever I got saved, and it was just, such a big deal in my life because it was a change, I had one, let's just call her a relative, one relative, who had kind of like this attitude, oh, well, what's the big to do about getting saved? I've been saved a long time. And I look back on her life and I thought, my word, you've been saved? I knew some of the people she'd been dating. They were as lost as Frankenstein was. And she seemed to never notice there was an inconsistency there. Instead of being ashamed of her life and getting converted along with me, it was, well, I've been saved. What's the big deal about getting saved and losing all of your friends. I've been saved a lot. In other words, her argument was, I've been saved and it hasn't affected my life. I've been saved and things have run smoothly for me. Between the lines, her argument was, I've been saved and it didn't make a difference to me. See, my salvation was different. And I didn't have to try to do anything. I mean, when you're saved, you're saved. That's my basic argument. I didn't have to try to lose friends or antagonize them. It just happened. I didn't want to do what they wanted to do. I didn't want to think what they wanted to talk about. So friends and acquaintances. And I couldn't imagine even today, especially today, I shouldn't say even, I should say especially after all these years, having a lost friend. Friend, acquaintance, neighbor, with whom I can be polite and say hello. A friend, go camping with and hunting and fishing, oh, it would just vex my soul. Because he wouldn't want to talk about what I want to talk about, and I wouldn't want to talk about what he would want to talk about. It would vex my soul. And it would affect my spiritual life. Number 2, models, role models, and authorities. And what do parents do? They let their children watch television. And what does television do? It encourages children to adopt role models, authority figures they are to emulate. And half the time it's some drunken, sadistic soul anyway, and that is going to affect your moral life. He says, for instance, if a football player who lives an immoral life is your son's great hero, odds are that he is going to have an effect on him. Because everything football player hero says is right, even his immoral life and existence. If your authority is a college professor, he means authority, someone you really look up to and admire. He's not saying you can't quote from a noted secular authority, but someone you look up to and admire. If your authority is a college professor with anti-Christian views, or you think Dr. So-and-so is one of the world's greatest experts on child rearing, even though his advice does not square with a Christian approach, then you will be affected by them. Number 3, third carrier, entertainment. The time we spend in entertainment is not just off hours. This is not just our extracurricular existence. Movies and music that glorify immorality can spread infection most quickly. You become cauterized, seared against things. What you once would have held in horror or been aghast at, it's just commonplace now to you because you've seen it on television so much. Entertainment. The next thing, number 4, is mass media, which he pretty much just mentioned. The mass media. Number 5, education. And number 6, work settings. We're going to come back to some of these and do some proving about other matters later. Work settings. Now here's what he means here. He says, especially those with training that is designed to teach us how to do things and impart certain kinds of values to us. Like a public school teacher. Or like, working for some politician or something. He's not saying just doing any type of work, but a work that in order for you to participate in, you have to adopt the value system behind it. He said that is very dangerous, and it certainly is. Work settings that encourage certain kinds of values that really have to be encouraged if that business or that company is going to go over, not under. I think maybe the best word to use here in conclusion this morning is the word clone, a new word today, C-L-O-N-E. The church wants to become a clone of the world. And that is such a sin in the eyes of God. With this argument, God expects us to get along in life. If people think I'm some Eastern Tennessee fundamentalist hillbilly, I won't be able to get along, and they're going to criticize me, and I'll have problems. He expects me to get along in life and not stand out like an ugly wart. Well, if you mean by expects me to get along to be acceptable unto the world, you're dead wrong. Scriptures with one voice condemn such satanic philosophy. God does not, quote, expect us to get along in the world, unquote. Or he wouldn't have given us all the warnings, be of good cheer, in the world you'll have tribulation, but I've overcome the world. He would have said, be of good cheer because you won't have tribulation in the world or out of the world. Praise God, everything will be fine for you. Well, see, John 16:33 doesn't say that. In the world, he said, you're going to have tribulation, but be of good cheer because I've overcome it. He said in John 15, if the world hates you, know that it hated me first. And you don't have to try to do something to get the world to hate you. If you are one way, if you believe, as G.K. Chesterton said, Christianity and only Christianity is a truth-telling thing, you're going to be hated for that. People are going to say, no, there are other avenues of knowledge and truth. And you should not be so narrow and so naive in your convictions. But we would beg to differ. This is not, it is narrowness, it is not naivete. We have thought about the matter. We have researched the matter. We have been willing to listen to other opinions and see what they have to offer. They all have nothing to offer but death. Some of us, maybe some of you more than myself, have lived in this world outside of Christ. We know what it has to offer. It has nothing but death to offer. We are fools to have lived that life which spelled death, to come into Christianity, which is life, and then to be convinced by the neo-evangelical argument that we ought to go back into the world. We'd be a fool to live that type of life. It doesn't matter to me if I ever stand out as an ugly wart in the world. It doesn't matter to me if because I stand out that way I lose my doorway of evangelism to someone. That's their problem, not mine. That's not going to affect me at the end of the day one way or the other. That's going to affect them. That's not even my problem. As I've said, I don't try to go out of my way to be weird or strange. I think I've had a good rapport with people that I've known. And if you think you have, make sure you don't ever use that as a compromise for your convictions and for your moral belief. You want to say, well, I want to be a good testimony here. And so I won't say that, or I won't tell them this. God knows it, and it grieves the Holy Spirit when we don't stand up for the truth. The truth is what's delivered us. We should be so grateful for that. We should be willing to stand up to it. Anything that you have, listen to me, that's good in life or whatever, you have gotten that because of your relationship to God. If you ever get prosperous, or you have a good family, or you raise your children well, and people comment on that, that's not of your own doing. And so as soon as someone pats you on the back for that, when you start taking the credit for that, God's going to chalk that up above. Because you never would have had those things or done the things that you did if you wouldn't have met Him. It's your life in Him that's caused you to do the good things or have the good things that you do. And you have to say, well, thanks for the compliment, but it's because I know the Bible and Christianity. That's why I have this. That's why my children are this way, or that's why my marriage is such and such. It's because of Jesus Christ. That glorifies God. For some Christians, it's kind of hard to get out in front of lost people. But just swallow hard and say it anyway. I'd rather say it red in the face than not at all. I only get a half of a check in heaven for that. Because I was red in the face. What is there to be? I mean, at the end of the day, this world's going to be burned up, and there'll be one God, one kingdom, and one way of looking at things, and it'll be your way that you have now. Why be afraid of letting it be known? At the end of the day, that's going to be the only way there is. All these people who are arguing for this philosophy, that philosophy, they're all going to be swept under the rug. And then the rug and them are going to be burned up. It's for the life of me, I can't understand why Christians would be ashamed of what they have or what they know today. And I'll tell you why, if you ever have a problem, why you have one. And you already know why. It's because you've got an enemy, Satan. He's trying to stop the word from being known. He's trying to make you ineffective in your own life. Whether you reach anyone else or not, make you ineffective in your own life. He knows if he can get you to be afraid of people and to compromise, then you're just asking for more trouble in your life.